What did you do when you realized the anniversary gift your husband gave you was actually meant for his mistress? I gave them both a night they'd never forget. On our 10-year anniversary, Reese handed me a beautifully wrapped box of perfume as a gift at dinner. It took me back because he knew strong scents made me dizzy and nauseous. But still, the perfume was classy and in small amounts smelled great, so I was thankful. Until later that night, while he was in the shower, his phone lit up. It was a text from a woman named Maxine. "Oh, Reese, you're so naughty!" Followed by the shy monkey emoji. "Excuse me? What?" I immediately unlocked his phone and saw exactly what she was referring to. Just 20 minutes ago, Reese had texted her. "I got my wife your perfume so I can smell you around the house." My stomach churned. I read it 3 more times to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. But it was still there, clear as day, along with flirty texts and pictures even I've never received. I felt my heart physically breaking as I read through parts where they mocked me, calling me easy to manipulate, how my husband wanted to be with her so bad, but the thrill of not getting caught was too exciting to just leave me. I glanced at the perfume bottle on the nightstand with tears in my eyes and decided then and there, if they wanted a thrill, they were going to get it, because perfume was flammable. First, I had to drive Reese crazy. The next morning, I put some of the perfume on, just a tiny spray on my wrists and neck. His face lit up instantly. "You're actually wearing it. I love how it smells," he said, kissing my cheek. He had no idea what was coming. Soon, I started casually mentioning all the places he'd taken his mistress. "Have you seen this pasta place?" I'd ask when planning dinner dates. I was thinking of having lunch at Julio's Cafe. Reese's coffee dripped out of his mouth every time. I've never heard of those," he lied, squirming in his seat. The next day, I brought him a pamphlet. "I was thinking of getting my nails done at this salon downtown. What do you think?" This was Maxine's workplace. He stared at me with sweat beading down his forehead, studying my face to see if I knew. "You've never liked the way they do nails. Would you really go there?" he asked, testing me back. I shrugged. "Maybe one day, but not today." He sighed in relief. But then came the really fun part. We were at his parents' house for dinner. I was wearing the perfume he'd given me when the topic of kids came up. His mom mentioned wanting grandchildren someday. I grinned and turned to Reese. "You know, if we ever have a daughter, I've always loved the name Maxine." The soda nearly slipped from his hand. He coughed and stammered, saying he'd prefer other names, but his mom insisted Maxine would be a lovely name. "What made you think of it?" she asked me. Reese turned to me with wide eyes, clearly wondering if I knew, but it wasn't time to drop it yet. "Well, it's a name that's very hard to forget. Just so lovely and unique," I said, acting oblivious. After that night, Reese's paranoia got worse. He started watching me constantly, panicking every time I mentioned anything close to Maxine's name. He was so stressed he picked up smoking cigarettes just like she did. His text to her showed how paranoid he was. I thought all of this would have put an end to his affair, make him lose us both. But I was wrong. Reese announced he had a work trip coming up, a conference in another city on the day of Maxine's birthday. This was it, what I'd been waiting for. The night before his trip, I did my research, found the exact hotel they were staying at, one of those down-low illegal ones that allows you to smoke in the rooms. Instead of confronting him, I helped him pack, folded his shirts and pants neatly into his suitcase like the perfect wife. Then, without him knowing, I took the perfume bottle and sprayed the flammable perfume everywhere. On his shirts, his jacket, even his ties. Reese laughed when he stepped into the room to pick up the suitcase. "Honey, you've practically marinated my wardrobe." I smiled. "It's so you can smell me even when you're away." I watched him carry the suitcase into his car and drive off. That was the last time I saw him like that. Because that night, at 2 a.m, I got the call I'd been waiting for. "Hello? Is this Reese's wife? This is a nurse from Halter's General Hospital. Your husband's been in an accident." I grinned, my heart racing. When I got to the hospital, I rushed in completely breathless and in tears. "Where is he? Where's my Reese?" I begged. They led me to a room filled with doctors, nurses, and officers. One of them pulled me aside and explained what happened. There was a fire inside the room. Apparently, a cigarette your husband was smoking set his clothes on fire. I gasped. "How could that even happen?" The officer frowned. "His clothes had flammable perfume on them. I'm sorry to say this, but your husband was having an affair. We found the exact perfume bottle in the woman's makeup bag. We suspect she planned this, but got caught in the fire as well." I stuck around playing the heartbroken wife. Soon Reese woke up, confused and in pain. When he saw me, I said nothing. Just pulled out a small perfume bottle and started spraying it around his bed. "So, honey, about Maxine." His eyes went huge and his mouth opened, but nothing came out. I kept spraying the perfume in slow circles around his bed, watching the panic spread across his face like I was some kind of ghost he couldn't escape from. The bandages on his arms twitched as he tried to move them, but the burns made it impossible. I leaned down close to his ear and whispered that we really needed to have a long talk about his girlfriend and that hotel room. His breathing got faster, and I could see sweat forming on his forehead, even though the room was cold. He tried to say something, but his voice cracked and came out like a squeak. The perfume smell filled the whole space, and I watched him realize what I was doing, spraying the same scent that had caused all this pain right back at him like some kind of sick reminder. A doctor burst through the door and yelled at me to stop immediately. He grabbed the perfume bottle right out of my hand and told a nurse to get me out of there. I switched my face to shocked and concerned in half a second. my eyes filling up with tears as I apologized over and over. I told them I just thought he'd want to smell something familiar from home, that I didn't know it would upset him. The nurse took my arm gently and walked me toward the hallway, while I kept looking back at Reese with this worried expression plastered on my face. He was staring at me with pure terror, and I knew he understood everything now. Out in the hallway, the head nurse introduced herself as Honoria Giles and pulled me into a small consultation room. She had kind eyes and spoke in this soft voice as she explained that Reese had second-degree burns covering 30% of his body. Most of the damage was on his torso and arms where his shirt had caught fire first. She said the pain was intense and he'd need weeks of treatment and probably some skin grafts. Then she paused and told me that Maxine was in much worse shape. The burns on her face and hands were severe because she'd tried to put out the flames with her bare hands. Honoria explained that Maxine would need multiple surgeries and the scarring would be permanent. I made myself look devastated and asked if they were both going to be okay. She said yes, but their lives would never be the same. I nodded and covered my face with my hands like I was crying, but really I was just hiding the fact that I felt nothing but cold satisfaction hearing about their injuries. I spent the next few hours in the waiting room playing the part of the devastated wife perfectly. I sat in those uncomfortable plastic chairs with my hands folded in my lap, staring at the floor like I was in shock. My mind kept running through every step of my plan, checking for anything I might have missed. Did I leave any evidence? Could they trace the perfume back to me? Would Reese tell them what I'd done? Other people started showing up as news of the fire spread through our families. Reese's brother arrived first, then some cousins I barely knew. Finally, Geneva walked in, and I had to stand up and let her hug me while she sobbed into my shoulder. She kept saying her poor baby, her poor son. How could this have happened? I rubbed her back and made soothing sounds while inside I was thinking about how she'd raised a cheater and a liar. She pulled back and looked at my face, searching for something, and I made sure my expression showed nothing but worry and confusion. We sat together in those awful chairs, and I held her hand while she cried, playing the supportive daughter-in-law even though I wanted to tell her the truth about her precious son. Late that night, maybe around 11, a detective approached me in the waiting room. He introduced himself as Marius Giles and said he needed to ask some questions about the incident. I stood up and followed him to a quieter corner, keeping my face neutral and cooperative. He asked about Reese's trip, and I explained it was for a work conference in another city. My voice stayed steady as I told him how I'd helped pack his suitcase the night before, folding all his clothes carefully because I wanted him to look professional. The detective wrote everything down in his little notebook. Then he asked why Maxine would be at the same hotel, and I let confusion cross my face. I said I had no idea who she was or why she'd be there with my husband. He watched my reaction carefully, and I could tell he was trying to see if I was lying. I added that maybe she was a coworker attending the same conference, trying to sound helpful and innocent. He nodded slowly, but his eyes stayed on my face like he was studying every tiny movement. The detective's questions felt pretty basic at first, just gathering information about the timeline and Reese's plans. But then he shifted and asked specifically about the perfume. He wanted to know if I was aware that perfume could be flammable. My stomach tightened, but I kept my face confused and shook my head. I told him I had no idea, that it was just regular perfume. He asked where I got it, and I explained that Reese had given it to me as an anniversary gift just a couple weeks ago. I could see him processing this information and making notes. He asked if I'd sprayed any on Reese's clothes when I packed, and I said maybe a little, just so he could smell me while he was away. My voice cracked slightly on that part, like I was a devoted wife who missed her husband. The detective thanked me for my time and said he might have more questions later. I nodded and went back to the waiting room, my heart pounding even though my face stayed calm. I finally left the hospital around 3 in the morning when they said Reese was stable and sleeping. The drive home felt strange and wrong. My hands wouldn't stop shaking on the steering wheel no matter how hard I gripped it. The streets were empty and dark, and I kept seeing Reese's burned arms in my mind. The reality of what I'd done started pushing through the satisfaction I'd felt earlier. He could have died. Maxine might still die. I'd deliberately created the conditions for them to catch fire, and now they were both lying in the hospital beds covered in burns. The car swerved slightly and I had to focus harder on the road. Part of me felt vindicated, like they deserved consequences for what they did to me. But another part was starting to understand the weight of causing that much physical pain to another human being. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for 10 minutes, just staring at my house and trying to process everything. Inside, I went straight to the kitchen trash can where I'd thrown the perfume box days ago. I dug through coffee grounds and food scraps until I found it at the bottom. The box was slightly damp but still readable. Right there on the back in small print were warnings about flammability and keeping away from heat sources and open flames. My heart started racing as I read the words over and over. This was evidence that I should have known, that I'd seen these warnings and ignored them. I grabbed the box and walked to the fireplace in the living room. My hands trembled as I struck a match and held it to the cardboard. The box caught quickly and I watched it curl and blacken, the warning labels disappearing into ash. I poked at it with the fireplace tool until nothing was left but gray dust. Then I washed my hands 3 times, scrubbing hard like I could wash away what I'd done along with the ash residue. I barely slept that night and called my mom around 6 in the morning. Rita said she'd leave right away and made the 3-hour drive in record time. She got to my house just after 9 and wrapped me in a hug the second I opened the door. I let myself cry for real this time, not the fake tears I'd been using at the hospital. She held me tight and stroked my hair and told me everything would be okay. We moved to the couch and she kept her arm around me while I sobbed into her shoulder. For the first time since discovering the affair, I let myself feel genuine emotion instead of cold calculation. The tears came hard and fast and I couldn't stop them. Rita just held me and didn't ask questions, letting me get it all out. When I finally calmed down enough to breathe normally, she pulled back and looked at my face with concern. She asked what happened, and I knew I had to tell her about Reese and Maxine, even though it meant admitting how badly my marriage had failed. I started from the beginning, telling her about the anniversary perfume and the text message I'd seen on Reese's phone. Rita's expression shifted from sympathy to shock as I explained about the affair with Maxine. I showed her some of the texts I'd screenshot before everything happened, the ones where they mocked me and called me easy to manipulate. Her face got harder with each message she read. By the time I finished explaining about the hotel fire and both of them getting burned, her sympathy had turned into cold anger. She asked how long the affair had been going on, and I told her at least 8 months based on the texts. Rita stood up and paced across my living room, her hands clenched into fists. She said she couldn't believe Reese would do this after 10 years of marriage, that she'd trusted him with her daughter. Then she turned and looked at me with this expression I couldn't quite read, like she was seeing me differently somehow. She asked how I was holding up, and I realized I didn't have a good answer to that question. Rita drove me back to the hospital around noon because I knew I had to keep up appearances. We walked through the sliding doors and the smell of cleaning products mixed with something burnt hit me right away. Rita squeezed my hand as we headed toward the burn unit where they'd moved Reese overnight. A man in his 30s stood near the nurse's station, tall with the same dark hair as Reese but without the beard. He looked up when we approached and his face went soft with sympathy. He walked over and introduced himself as Caleb, Reese's brother, and pulled me into an awkward hug. Rita excused herself to get coffee while Caleb led me to a quiet corner near the vending machines. He rubbed the back of his neck and told me he was sorry about what his brother did. I started to respond, but he held up his hand and said Reese had confessed everything during a lucid moment earlier that morning. My stomach dropped, but I kept my face neutral. Caleb explained that Reese told him about Maxine, about the affair, about all of it. He said his brother was a complete idiot and he understood if I wanted to leave him. I played my part perfectly, letting tears fill my eyes while I asked how long it had been going on. Caleb shifted his weight and said 8 months according to Reese. 8 whole months of lies and sneaking around. He told me Maxine actually thought Reese was going to leave me, that she'd been pushing him to file for divorce. The birthday trip was supposed to be when Reese finally told her the truth, that he had no plans to actually end our marriage. He just liked the excitement of the affair, the thrill of not getting caught. Caleb looked disgusted as he said it. I wiped my eyes and thanked him for being honest with me. A woman in a dark blazer approached us holding a tablet and a badge clipped to her belt. She introduced herself as Saoirse Moreau from the Fire Investigation Unit. Detective Giles appeared behind her, the same officer from last night. They asked if I had a few minutes to answer some questions, and I nodded. We moved to a small conference room down the hall. Saoirse sat across from me and pulled up photos on her tablet showing the hotel room, burnt clothes and the perfume bottle they'd recovered from Maxine's makeup bag. She asked me detailed questions about my knowledge of flammable materials. I stuck to my story, telling her I had no idea perfume could be dangerous like that. She asked if I'd ever read warning labels on beauty products, and I shrugged, saying I usually just threw away the boxes without looking. Detective Giles leaned forward and asked about my chemistry background. I told him I was never good at science in the school, barely passed my classes. Saoirse's eyes narrowed slightly like she was trying to read my face. She asked why I'd sprayed so much perfume on Reese's clothes if I knew strong scents made me sick. I explained that I wanted him to smell nice for his conference, that I thought it would make him think of me while he was away. The lie came out smooth and natural. Saoirse made notes on her tablet while Detective Giles watched me carefully. They thanked me for my time and said they'd be in touch if they had more questions. I left the conference room with shaky legs and found Rita waiting in the hallway. The doctor spotted us and waved us over to discuss the patients. He said Maxine's condition had stabilized overnight, but she'd need multiple skin graft surgeries over the next several months. Her burns were severe, especially on her hands and face where she'd tried to put out the flames. Reese was improving faster with second-degree burns mostly on his torso and arms. The doctor said he'd have permanent scarring and possibly nerve damage in his hands that might affect his ability to work. I made all the right concerned noises while my mind raced. Rita and I headed to the cafeteria because I hadn't eaten since yesterday. We got in line for sandwiches when Geneva appeared next to me. Her eyes were red from crying, but her jaw was set tight. She grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the line. Rita started to follow, but Geneva shot her a look that made her stop. Geneva demanded to know if I somehow caused this fire. Her voice shook but stayed low enough that other people couldn't hear. She said her mother's gut told her something was wrong, that the timing was too perfect. I pulled my arm free and told her I was just as shocked as everyone else. She stepped closer and said she'd been thinking about all those weird comments I made, about Maxine's name and the nail salon and those restaurants. Her face twisted with anger as she asked if I knew about the affair before the fire. I looked her right in the eyes and lied, saying I had no idea until the hospital told me last night. Geneva stared at me for a long moment before walking away without another word. Rita came over and asked what that was about. I told her Geneva was just upset and looking for someone to blame. We ate our sandwiches in tense silence. After lunch, Rita said she needed to head home to check on some things but would come back tomorrow. I hugged her goodbye and waited until she left before heading back upstairs. Geneva had left to make phone calls, so I slipped into Reese's room alone. He was awake, staring at the ceiling with bandages covering his arms. He turned his head when he heard me come in. His voice came out hoarse and rough when he asked if I knew what would happen. I pulled a chair close to his bed and smiled. I told him we'd discuss it when he was feeling better. His eyes went wide and he tried to sit up, but the pain stopped him. I patted his unbandaged leg and left the room. 3 days passed in a blur of hospital visits and pretending everything was normal. Detective Giles called my cell on the 4th morning and asked me to come to the police station for a formal interview. My hands went cold as I agreed. I called Rita immediately and she gave me the number for Artemisia Hanley, a lawyer her friend had used last year. Artemisia met me at the station an hour later, a sharp woman in her 40s with gray streaks in her dark hair. She told me to be cooperative but careful, to answer only what they asked and nothing more. We sat in a small interview room with Detective Giles and another officer I didn't recognize. They set Reese's phone on the table between us. Detective Giles pulled up the text messages, the ones where Reese told Maxine he'd given me her perfume. Then he showed me texts from my own phone, all the manipulation tactics I'd used over those weeks. My stomach dropped as I realized they'd been building a case against me this whole time. They had screenshots of me mentioning the restaurants, the nail salon, the name Maxine. They had evidence of me researching that hotel. Artemisia put her hand on my arm and said we needed a moment alone. The officers left the room. Artemisia turned to me and said in a flat voice that I was investigated for reckless endangerment and possibly attempted murder. The texts showed premeditation, showed I knew about the affair, showed I'd deliberately created dangerous conditions. She asked me point blank if I knew the perfume was flammable when I sprayed it on his clothes. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Artemisia stared at me across the metal table, her pen tapping 3 times against her notepad. She leaned forward and asked in a quieter voice if I understood what attorney-client privilege meant. I nodded slowly, my throat tight. She explained that anything I told her stayed between us, that she couldn't defend me properly if I lied to her. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead while I tried to decide how much truth to give her. Finally, I admitted that yes, I knew the perfume had alcohol in it, that I'd seen the warning labels. Her face didn't change, but she closed her notepad and told the officers through the door that we needed more time. Detective Giles said we had 15 minutes before they'd resume. Artemisia turned back to me and laid out my options in plain terms. Either I cooperated now and let her build a defense, or I kept lying and ended up in prison when they proved I was lying anyway. She asked me point blank what my goal had been when I sprayed Reese's clothes. I looked down at my hands and said I wanted him to suffer like I was suffering, that I wanted Maxine to know what she'd done. Artemisia wrote something down and said that wasn't the same as intending to set them on fire. She asked if I specifically planned for a fire to happen. I shook my head and meant it, because I hadn't thought through the exact details, just knew the perfume was dangerous around cigarettes. She seemed to believe me and said we could work with that. The interview resumed and Artemisia did most of the talking, explaining that I'd acted out of emotional distress without fully understanding the consequences. Detective Giles looked skeptical but didn't push harder that day. They let me leave 2 hours later with instructions not to leave town. Rita was waiting in the parking lot, her face tight with worry. She drove me home without asking questions, which I appreciated because I couldn't have explained anything right then. When we pulled into my driveway, I saw Geneva's car parked in front along with 2 other vehicles I recognized from family gatherings. My stomach dropped as I realized what was happening. Rita grabbed my arm and asked if I wanted her to come in with me, but I shook my head and got out alone. The front door was unlocked. Inside, Geneva stood in my living room directing Reese's cousin and uncle as they carried boxes out to a truck. She turned when she heard me come in, her eyes red from crying but her jaw set hard. She told me I had some nerve showing up here after what I'd done to her son. I asked what they were doing with my things and she laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. She said these weren't my things, they were Reese's things, and he didn't want me anywhere near them or him. His cousin walked past carrying the framed photo from our wedding, not looking at me. Geneva stepped closer and said they all knew what I'd done, that the police had told them about the texts and the manipulation. She said I was sick and twisted and she'd make sure everyone knew it. I stood there taking it because what could I say that wouldn't make it worse? She told me I wasn't welcome at the hospital anymore, that if I tried to visit Reese, she'd have me arrested for harassment. Then she walked past me and out the door, leaving me standing in my half-empty living room. Caleb appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, holding a box of Reese's books. He set it down carefully and closed the front door that Geneva had left open. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. He finally said he'd volunteered to stay behind to talk to me. I asked if he was here to tell me what a terrible person I was, too. He shook his head and sat down on the couch, gesturing for me to sit. He said he understood why I did it, even if he couldn't say it was okay. His brother had destroyed our marriage through his own choices, had humiliated me and mocked me with that woman. Caleb said he'd told Reese he was an idiot months ago when he first found out about the affair. But then he looked at me with tired eyes and said I'd gone too far in my response. He said Reese would live with those scars forever, that Maxine might never look normal again, and that I'd have to live with causing that. I felt tears starting but forced them back. Caleb stood up and picked up the box again. He told me he hoped I'd find some peace somehow, but that he couldn't be around me anymore. The family had made their choice and he had to stick with them. After he left, I sat in the quiet house for an hour before Rita came back in. She'd been waiting in the car to give me privacy. She found me still sitting there and didn't ask what happened, just started making tea in the kitchen like everything was normal. The next morning, my phone started buzzing with texts from people I barely knew. The local news had picked up the story about the hotel fire. I pulled up the article on my laptop and felt sick reading it. They called it a tragic accident, mentioned that a married man and his companion had been severely burned when his clothing caught fire from a cigarette. The article said investigators were looking into how his clothes became soaked with flammable perfume. They didn't name me, but anyone who knew us would figure it out fast. Within hours, my neighbor knocked on the door to ask if I'd heard about the terrible fire at that hotel. She said her prayers were with me during this difficult time. I thanked her and closed the door, my face hot with shame. Another neighbor stopped me when I went to get the mail, saying she couldn't believe what Reese had done to me, having an affair like that. She squeezed my hand and said I was so brave for standing by him at the hospital. I wanted to scream that I wasn't brave, that I'd caused the whole thing, but instead I smiled and said I appreciated her support. Every interaction felt like walking through a minefield. I kept waiting for someone to look at me and just know what I'd really done. The paranoia got so bad I stopped answering the door and let the curtain stay closed all day. Artemisia called 3 days later and asked me to meet her at my house. She arrived with a briefcase full of papers, and we sat at my kitchen table while she laid out my legal situation in terms I couldn't misunderstand. The prosecution was building a case that I'd deliberately created dangerous conditions knowing Reese smoked around the perfume-soaked clothes. She said they'd argue it was planned, that all my manipulation in the weeks before showed I was setting him up. I asked what that meant for me, and she said it meant they might try for attempted murder charges if they could prove intent. My hands started shaking so hard I had to put down my coffee mug. She spread out printed copies of text messages, my internet search history, witness statements from people who'd heard me mention Maxine's name at that dinner. Everything looked so much worse laid out on paper like that. Artemisia asked me again exactly what I'd been thinking when I sprayed his clothes. I told her the truth this time, all of it. How I'd wanted him to smell the perfume and think of me while he was with her. How I'd known it was flammable, but hadn't really thought through what that meant. I said I wanted something bad to happen, but I didn't specifically plan a fire. She listened without interrupting, taking notes the whole time. When I finished, Artemisia set down her pen and looked at me for a long moment. She said my honesty with her was protected, and I should never repeat what I'd just told her to anyone else, not even my mother. She explained that we needed to build a defense around lack of specific intent to harm. I'd acted recklessly out of emotional distress but hadn't deliberately tried to set them on fire. She asked if I could live with that version of events when we went to trial. I nodded because what choice did I have? She started packing up her papers and said she'd be in touch about next steps. Before she left, she turned back and told me to prepare myself because things were going to get worse before they got better. She said the media attention would grow, that Reese's family would probably speak out against me, and that I needed to stay quiet and let her handle everything. I promised I would. After she left, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the coffee ring stains and wondering how my life had turned into this nightmare. 2 days later, a man named Perry Mack called my cell phone. He introduced himself as an insurance investigator looking into the hotel fire claim. My heart started racing as he asked if we could meet to discuss some details. I told him I'd have to check with my lawyer first. He said that was fine, but he'd really appreciate my cooperation since this was just routine investigation. His voice was friendly, but I could hear the suspicion under it. I called Artemisia immediately, and she said not to meet with him without her present. She contacted Perry and set up a meeting for the following week at her office. When we finally sat down with him, Perry had a folder full of photos from the fire scene and questions about the perfume. He asked me where I'd bought it, when I'd first noticed Reese smoking, whether I knew about the flammability warnings. Artemisia answered most of the questions for me, keeping my responses minimal. Perry asked specifically if I'd known about Reese's smoking habit before packing his suitcase. I said yes, he'd recently started smoking. Perry wrote that down and asked if it concerned me. I said of course it concerned me, smoking was bad for his health. He gave me a look that said he knew I was being careful with my words. Before he left, Perry mentioned that insurance fraud was a serious crime, and they'd be conducting a thorough investigation. The threat was clear even though he smiled when he said it. Artemisia called me that evening with more bad news. Maxine's family was considering a civil lawsuit against me for her injuries. She said they could sue regardless of whether criminal charges stuck, and if they won, I'd be financially destroyed. I asked how much they might sue for, and she said probably hundreds of thousands for medical bills, pain and suffering, lost wages. I didn't have that kind of money, not even close. She said they might try to take the house, my car, any assets from the divorce settlement. I felt the walls closing in as I realized I could lose everything even if I stayed out of prison. Artemisia said she'd try to negotiate with their lawyer, but I should prepare for the worst. That night I couldn't sleep. Just lay in bed doing math in my head about how much debt I'd be in for the rest of my life. Everything I'd worked for, the house Reese and I had bought together, the savings account I'd built up over 10 years, all of it would go to paying for the damage I'd caused. The revenge that had felt so satisfying when I was planning it now felt like poison spreading through every part of my life. Rita came over the next afternoon to help me sort through some boxes Geneva's family had left behind. I was in the garage looking for old tax documents when I heard her call my name from inside the house. Her voice sounded strange, tight, and upset. I went inside and found her standing in my home office holding my laptop. She asked me when I was going to tell her the truth. I didn't understand at first, then saw what was on the screen. My internet search history from weeks before the fire. Searches for flammable perfumes, for hotels that allowed smoking, for how alcohol content affected flammability. Rita's face was pale and her hands trembled as she held the laptop toward me. She said she'd been looking for an old photo I'd mentioned and found this instead. I tried to explain, but the words came out wrong, defensive and panicked. She cut me off and said she didn't want to hear excuses. She told me she'd raised me better than to deliberately hurt people, that she'd taught me right from wrong. Her disappointment hit harder than Geneva's anger had. I started crying and said I was sorry, that I'd been so mad I couldn't think straight. Rita set down the laptop and said being mad didn't excuse what I'd done. She said Reese had hurt me badly, but I'd responded by nearly killing 2 people. She asked if I understood how serious that was. I nodded, but she shook her head and said I clearly didn't, or I never would have done it. We sat in the living room and had the most painful conversation of my life. Rita said she understood my anger at discovering the affair, that any wife would feel betrayed and humiliated. But she said revenge had poisoned me into someone she didn't recognize. The daughter she'd raised would have left Reese, would have taken the high road and moved on with dignity. Instead, I'd let hate turn me into someone who could hurt people on purpose. She asked me if I even felt guilty about what happened to Maxine, who'd been stupid and selfish but didn't deserve to have her face burned. I admitted I'd been trying not to think about Maxine because when I did, I felt sick with guilt. Rita said that guilt was the only healthy thing I'd felt in weeks, and I needed to sit with it instead of pushing it away. She told me I had to face what I'd done and figure out how to live with it. Then she said something that broke me completely. She said revenge had poisoned me into someone she didn't recognize, and I realized she was right. I'd been so focused on making Reese suffer that I'd lost track of who I was. The satisfaction I'd felt watching him in that hospital bed now felt hollow and wrong. Rita stayed for another hour, but the distance between us felt huge even sitting on the same couch. When she left, she hugged me, but it felt different. Careful. Like she wasn't sure who she was hugging anymore. 2 weeks after the fire, Caleb texted me a photo he thought I should see. It showed Reese leaving the hospital with Geneva supporting his arm, bandages still covering both his arms from wrist to elbow. His face looked thinner, older somehow, and he moved slowly like every step hurt. The caption from some local news site called it a miracle recovery. I stared at that photo for a long time, studying Reese's expression. He looked defeated in a way that had nothing to do with the physical pain. I'd wanted him to suffer, and he clearly was, but seeing it didn't feel good anymore. Instead, I felt an unexpected wave of guilt that made my chest tight. This was the man I'd spent 10 years with, who'd held me when my dad died, who'd laughed at my stupid jokes and knew how I took my coffee. The affair had destroyed that person in my mind, turned him into just a target for my revenge. But looking at him now, broken and scared, I couldn't pretend he was just some villain anymore. He was a real person who'd made terrible choices and was now paying for them in ways that would last forever. And I was the one who'd decided his punishment. I deleted the photo but couldn't stop seeing it in my head. That night, I finally let myself cry. Not for my marriage or my ruined life, but for what I'd become in the name of getting even. 3 days after Rita left, I got a call from the hospital about Maxine. The nurse told me she was transferred to a specialized burn center 2 hours away for more surgeries. I asked how she was doing, and the nurse paused before saying Maxine had lost her job at the salon because of her injuries and didn't have health insurance to cover the treatment. The hospital was working with a charity fund to help pay for her care. I hung up and stared at my phone, processing what that meant. Maxine's life was destroyed. Her face was scarred, her hands were damaged, she had no job and no way to pay for the medical care she needed, and I had caused all of it. I spent the rest of that day sitting on my couch, unable to move or think about anything else. A week later, Detective Giles called and asked me to come to the station for another interview. I contacted Artemisia immediately, and she met me there, looking serious as we walked into the interrogation room together. Giles sat across from us with a folder full of papers and started laying them out one by one. He showed me printouts of my internet search history from 3 weeks before the fire. There it was in black and white. Searches for flammable perfumes, perfume alcohol content, how hot cigarettes burn, hotel fire safety regulations. My stomach dropped as I stared at the evidence. Artemisia jumped in quickly, saying that research doesn't prove intent to harm. She argued I could have been looking up perfume safety for any number of innocent reasons, maybe worried about the perfume Reese gave me. But I could see Giles didn't buy it. He pulled out more pages showing the timeline of my searches matched exactly with when I started my manipulation campaign against Reese. He asked me directly if I knew the perfume was dangerous when I sprayed it on Reese's clothes. Artemisia told me not to answer. The interview ended with Giles saying the prosecutor was building a strong case and I should prepare myself. Walking out of the station, Artemisia pulled me aside in the parking lot. She said the prosecutor had contacted her with a plea deal offer. If I pleaded guilty to reckless endangerment, I'd get probation and have to pay money to Maxine for her medical bills, but I'd avoid jail time. The deal was on the table for 1 week. After that, they'd proceed with attempted murder charges and take it to trial. I asked what she thought I should do. Artemisia said it was my choice, but a trial would be risky. All the details of my manipulation would become public record. The jury would hear about how I deliberately drove Reese crazy, how I researched flammable materials, how I carefully planned everything. Even if I claimed I didn't know the clothes would catch fire, the evidence made my intent look pretty clear. But accepting the plea meant admitting guilt and having a criminal record forever. I drove home in a daze and spent that night lying awake in bed, going over my options again and again. A trial meant everyone would know exactly what I did. My friends, my coworkers, Everyone in town would read about how I manipulated my husband and caused 2 people to get burned. The local news would cover it. My face would be everywhere. But a plea deal meant saying, yes, I did this. I'm guilty. It meant accepting that I was a criminal who hurt people on purpose. It meant paying money I didn't have and being on probation for years. I couldn't sleep. I kept getting up and pacing around my apartment, making tea I didn't drink, staring at my phone without really seeing it. The next few nights were the same. I'd lie in bed until 2 or 3 in the morning, my mind racing through every possible outcome. Then I'd finally fall asleep for a couple hours and wake up feeling worse than before. I stopped eating much because food made me feel sick. I'd make toast and take 2 bites before throwing it away. My hands shook when I tried to hold my coffee cup. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped, thinking it was the police or a lawyer or someone else with bad news. On the 4th night, someone knocked on my door around 9. I opened it to find Caleb standing there looking uncomfortable. He asked if he could come in and I let him, confused about why he was there. We sat in my living room and he told me he'd been to see Reese that afternoon. His brother was struggling badly with depression and pain management. The doctors had him on strong medication, but Reese was having a hard time dealing with what happened. Caleb said Reese knew the affair caused all of this, that his choices led to the fire. But knowing that didn't make the physical pain any less, or help with the emotional damage from the burns. Reese was seeing a therapist twice a week and barely leaving Geneva's house. He couldn't look at himself in the mirror without breaking down. Caleb said he wasn't telling me this to make me feel bad, but he thought I should know what Reese was going through. I asked why he came to tell me this in secret. Caleb said because despite everything, he understood why I did what I did. Reese had destroyed our marriage through his affair and treated me terribly. But 2 wrongs didn't make a right, and now everyone involved was paying a price that would last forever. He left after that and I sat alone in my apartment, processing what he'd said. That night was worse than the others. I couldn't sleep at all. I realized I wasn't just not sleeping well. I was barely sleeping at all anymore. Maybe 2 or 3 hours a night at most. I'd stopped eating regular meals. I was down to maybe 1 small meal a day, and even that was hard to get down. I jumped at every sound. A car door slamming outside made my heart race. My phone buzzing made me feel sick with panic. The weight of what I'd done was crushing me in ways I never expected when I was planning my revenge. Back then, I'd felt powerful and in control. Now I felt like I was drowning and couldn't find the surface. The next morning, Artemisia called and said she'd arranged for me to meet with a therapist who worked with people dealing with trauma and something called moral injury. She said I needed to talk to someone professional about what I was going through. The therapist's office was in a quiet building downtown. I sat in her waiting room feeling like everyone could see what I'd done just by looking at me. When she called me back, I sat on her couch and didn't know where to start. She asked me to tell her what brought me in. I explained the whole thing, from finding out about the affair, to the fire, to facing criminal charges now. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said something that surprised me. She said I could hold 2 truths at the same time. Reese's betrayal was real and the pain he caused me was real. And my response was destructive and caused serious harm to 2 people. Both things could be true. I didn't have to choose between saying the affair didn't matter or saying what I did was okay. I could accept that I was deeply hurt and that I responded in a way that was wrong. We talked for the full hour, and by the end, I felt like maybe I could start processing all of this. She gave me homework to write down my thoughts and feelings each day. 2 days later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered and heard Geneva's voice, cold and formal. She said Reese wanted to proceed with divorce and his lawyer would be contacting me. She said if I didn't contest it and didn't try to take more than my fair share, Reese would be willing to split things fairly given the circumstances. I asked if I could talk to Reese directly. Geneva said no, he didn't want to speak to me. All communication would go through lawyers. She hung up before I could say anything else. The next week, I met with Reese's attorney at his office downtown. His name was Aldrich, and he was professional but not unkind. He spread out divorce papers on his desk and walked me through them. Reese was offering me half of our savings, my car, and some of the furniture. He'd keep the house and his retirement accounts. Looking at the terms, I realized they were actually generous considering everything that happened. Aldrich said Reese just wanted this over with as quickly and quietly as possible. I signed the papers without arguing about anything. What was the point? Our marriage was dead and I'd killed it just as much as Reese had. That same afternoon, Artemisia called with news. The prosecutor had withdrawn the attempted murder charge but was moving forward with reckless endangerment and assault charges. Artemisia said this was actually good news. It meant they couldn't prove I specifically intended to cause the fire. They could prove I created dangerous conditions and that people got hurt because of my actions, but not that I planned for them to catch fire. The plea deal was still on the table if I wanted it. I had 2 more days to decide. I called Artemisia the next morning and told her I wasn't taking the deal. She was quiet for a long moment before asking if I was sure. I said yes. I could convince a jury that I didn't actually know the perfume would catch fire. She warned me this was risky, that juries are unpredictable and the evidence looked bad, but she said she'd respect my decision and start preparing for trial. We scheduled meetings to go over my testimony and build our defense strategy. The preliminary hearing happened 3 weeks later at the county courthouse. I wore a simple blue dress that Rita picked out, something that made me look sympathetic, but not like I was trying too hard. Artemisia walked me through the metal detectors and down the hallway to the courtroom. That's when I saw her. Maxine was standing near the prosecutor's table with a woman who must have been her lawyer. Her face had visible scarring along her left cheek and jaw, pink and shiny from the skin grafts. She wore a high-necked blouse that probably covered more scarring on her neck and chest. Our eyes met for just a second before she looked away fast, her hand moving up to touch the scars like she was checking if they were still there. I felt something twist in my stomach that might have been guilt. The hearing started with the judge reviewing the charges and asking both sides about their readiness for trial. Then the prosecutor stood up and started laying out their case. He described the affair in detail, reading text messages between Reese and Maxine out loud in the courtroom. Some of them were the mocking ones about me being easy to manipulate. I watched people's faces in the gallery, saw some of them frown and shake their heads. A few women looked at me with what seemed like sympathy, like they understood being betrayed like that. The prosecutor also mentioned my manipulation campaign, how I'd driven Reese paranoid on purpose. But when he got to that part, I noticed the sympathy in some faces didn't disappear. Maybe they thought he deserved to be messed with after what he did. That gave me a tiny bit of hope that a jury might see it the same way. Rita testified next as a character witness for me. She sat in the witness box looking smaller than usual, her hands folded in her lap. Artemisia asked her questions about what kind of person I was, whether I had a history of violence or vindictiveness. Rita said I'd always been kind and gentle, that this situation was completely out of character for me. But then the prosecutor cross-examined her and asked if she was disappointed in my actions. Rita's voice got quiet and she said yes. She was disappointed. She said she'd raised me to handle problems differently, not to deliberately hurt people no matter how much they hurt me first. Her honesty made my throat tight and my eyes burn, but I appreciated that she didn't just lie to make me look good. The judge set a trial date for 2 months out and we all left the courthouse. Rita hugged me in the parking lot and told me she still loved me even though she was disappointed. I held on to her probably longer than I should have. The 2 months crawled by with meetings at Artemisia's office, going over every detail of what I'd say on the stand. She drilled me on staying calm, not getting defensive, sticking to the story that I genuinely didn't know the clothes would ignite. We practiced my testimony dozens of times until I could recite it without thinking. Then finally the trial started on a cold morning in November. The courtroom was bigger than the one for the preliminary hearing, with more people in the gallery including some reporters. I sat at the defense table next to Artemisia, my hands shaking slightly as the jury filed in. 12 people who would decide if I was guilty or not. The prosecution's first witnesses were doctors and nurses who'd treated Reese and Maxine. They described the burns in medical terms that made them sound even worse than I'd imagined. Second-degree burns covering 30% of Reese's body, third-degree burns on Maxine's face and hands. They talked about skin grafts and infection risks and permanent nerve damage. Then the prosecutor displayed photos on a big screen at the front of the courtroom. Pictures of Reese's torso covered in angry red burns, of Maxine's face before the surgeries when the burns were fresh and raw. I had to look away, my hand covering my mouth as nausea rolled through me. I'd known they got hurt, but seeing it like that made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Artemisia squeezed my arm under the table. The next day, Reese took the stand. He looked thinner than before, his face drawn and tired. He wore a long-sleeved shirt that probably covered the scars on his arms. The prosecutor asked him about the affair, and Reese admitted everything, his voice steady at first. He confirmed the text messages were real, that he and Maxine had mocked me. But then his voice started breaking when he described the night of the fire, how he'd been smoking in the hotel room when his shirt suddenly caught fire, how fast the flames spread to his other clothes, how Maxine had tried to help him and got burned herself. He said he deserved consequences for betraying me, for being cruel in those messages. But not this. Not permanent physical damage and constant pain. I wanted to argue that he'd caused me permanent damage too, just not the kind you could see in photos. But I kept my face neutral like Artemisia had taught me. Maxine testified the following day wearing a scarf around her neck despite the warm courtroom. She kept her eyes down most of the time, not looking at me or Reese. She described her ongoing medical needs in a flat voice, the surgeries she still needed, the pain medication she took daily. She'd lost her job at the salon because customers didn't want someone with visible facial scars doing their nails. She had no health insurance and was living with her parents again at 32 years old. When the prosecutor asked if she regretted the affair, she said yes quietly. She admitted it was wrong to be with a married man, but she also said she was paying a price far beyond what she deserved for making a bad choice. The prosecutor's case built momentum over the next 2 days. They presented my internet search history showing I'd looked up flammable perfumes 3 weeks before the fire. They showed the text messages where I'd manipulated Reese, mentioning Maxine's workplace and suggesting her name for a baby. They built a timeline that made my intent look crystal clear. I watched the jury's faces and saw them shifting, their expressions hardening. The woman in the front row who'd seemed sympathetic before now looked at me with something like disgust. When it was my turn to testify, my legs felt weak walking to the witness stand. Artemisia guided me through my testimony carefully. I explained how destroyed I felt discovering the affair, reading those cruel messages about me. How I'd wanted to make Reese uncomfortable, yes, but never intended for anyone to get physically hurt. I admitted to the manipulation campaign but said I thought it was just psychological games, not dangerous. I said I genuinely believed the perfume was safe, that I'd sprayed it on the clothes so Reese would smell it and think of me, not so it would catch fire. My voice stayed steady through most of it, though it cracked a few times when talking about the betrayal. Then the prosecutor stood up for cross-examination and everything fell apart. He asked if I knew Reese smoked. I had to say yes. He asked if I'd ever seen warning labels on other products about flammability. I admitted I had, on hairspray and cleaning products. He asked if I'd deliberately researched flammable perfumes online. I tried to explain I was just curious, but it sounded weak even to me. He asked why I'd sprayed so much perfume on the clothes if I just wanted a light scent. I didn't have a good answer for that. Each question made my story sound less believable, made my intentions look more obvious. I could see Artemisia's worried expression from the defense table. When I finally stepped down from the witness stand, I knew my testimony hadn't helped my case at all. The jury went back to deliberate that same afternoon, and Artemisia told me it could take anywhere from hours to days. I drove home in a fog, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Rita was already at my house when I got there, having left the courtroom early to make dinner. She'd made chicken soup, which I couldn't eat. My stomach felt like it was full of rocks. That first night I barely slept, just stared at the ceiling replaying every moment of my testimony. The prosecutor's questions kept looping in my head, each one making me look worse than the last. Rita stayed in the guest room and checked on me every few hours, bringing water I didn't drink and snacks I couldn't touch. The next morning dragged by with no word from the courthouse. I paced around the living room while Rita sat on the couch watching me. Finally, she spoke up and asked if we could talk honestly about everything. I sat down across from her and she didn't hold back. She told me she understood I was hurt by what Reese did, that his affair was cruel and the texts mocking me were horrible. But then she looked me straight in the eye and said my need for revenge had consumed my better judgment completely. I tried to argue that Reese deserved consequences, but Rita cut me off. She reminded me I'd deliberately sprayed flammable perfume on his clothes knowing he smoked cigarettes. She said I'd let rage turn me into someone who could cause real physical harm to another person. The words stung because they were true. I started crying, admitting I never thought it would actually catch fire, that some part of me believed nothing would really happen. Rita held my hand and said, "That was the problem with revenge. It makes you reckless with other people's lives." We talked for hours that day about how the affair broke something in me, how I'd focused all my pain into this elaborate plan instead of just leaving. She asked why I didn't just divorce him when I found the texts, and I couldn't give her a good answer. The truth was I wanted him to hurt like I was hurting, wanted him to feel trapped and scared, but I'd gone way too far. The second day of deliberation was worse than the first. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped, thinking it was Artemisia calling with news. Rita made me eat toast and forced me to take a shower. We watched TV without really seeing it, just filling the silence. Around 4 in the afternoon, my phone finally rang. Artemisia's voice was calm and professional as she told me the jury had reached a verdict and we needed to be at the courthouse in an hour. The drive back felt surreal, like I was floating outside my body. Rita came with me and squeezed my hand as we walked into the courtroom. The jury filed in and I tried to read their faces, but they all looked blank and tired. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict and the 4 women stood up with a piece of paper. My heart hammered so hard I thought everyone could hear it. She read the verdict out loud in a clear voice. Guilty of reckless endangerment. Not guilty of assault. The courtroom erupted in whispers and I felt my knees go weak. Artemisia grabbed my arm to steady me and whispered that this was actually good. That reckless endangerment carried much lighter sentencing than assault. The judge banged his gavel and set a sentencing date for 3 weeks later. I turned around and saw Geneva in the back row staring at me with pure hatred. Caleb sat next to her looking sad and tired. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of meetings with Artemisia to prepare for sentencing. She explained that the judge had discretion in my sentence, could give me jail time or probation depending on various factors. We worked on a statement I'd read to the court expressing remorse. I practiced it over and over until the words felt hollow in my mouth. The day of sentencing arrived and I wore a simple navy dress that Rita picked out. The courtroom was less crowded this time, just immediate family and a few reporters. Maxine wasn't there, but her parents were, sitting on the opposite side looking grim. The judge asked if I had anything to say before sentencing. I stood up with shaking legs and read my prepared statement about being sorry for my actions and understanding the harm I caused. My voice cracked twice, but I got through it. Then the judge spoke, going through the factors he'd considered. He acknowledged the affair and emotional distress I'd experienced, but said that didn't justify creating dangerous conditions that resulted in serious injury. He sentenced me to 2 years probation, 500 hours of community service, and ordered me to pay $70,000 in restitution to Maxine for her medical bills. No jail time. I sat down feeling dizzy with relief and dread at the same time. $70,000 might as well have been $1 million. Artemisia leaned over and whispered that we'd figure out the money, that avoiding jail was the important thing. The divorce papers came through that same week, which felt like the universe piling everything on at once. Reese's lawyer Aldrich had drawn up terms that were actually fair given the circumstances. Reese would keep the house and most of our shared assets, which would offset the restitution I owed to Maxine. I'd walk away with almost nothing except my car and personal belongings. I signed the papers without reading them too carefully, just wanting it over with. Rita helped me pack up my stuff from the house over 2 days, boxing up 10 years of marriage into cardboard containers. We didn't talk much while we worked, just moved through rooms pulling my clothes from closets and my books from shelves. Geneva had already come through and taken family photos off the walls, leaving rectangular clean spots on the paint. The apartment Rita found for me was small, just a 1-bedroom in an older building across town. The rent was cheap enough that I could manage it with my part-time job, barely. Rita helped me move in and bought me basic furniture from a thrift store. Standing in my new living room surrounded by boxes, I felt the full weight of how completely my life had changed. Everything I'd built with Reese was gone, replaced by this tiny space that smelled like someone else's cooking. I started my community service the following week at a burn victim support center downtown. The coordinator who interviewed me knew about my case and assigned me there specifically. She said it with a knowing look that made clear this was intentional, making me face what I'd done. My first day I mostly did filing and answered phones, keeping my head down, but then I had to sit in on a support group meeting and listen to burn survivors talk about their recovery. A woman named Sarah described her third skin graft surgery and how painful the healing process was. A man talked about people staring at his scars when he went grocery shopping. Every story felt like a knife in my gut because I'd caused those exact injuries to 2 people. Over the next few weeks at the center, I met person after person whose lives were changed forever by fire. Some were accident victims, some were attacked by others, but all of them lived with permanent physical and emotional scars. I helped coordinate their support groups, drove them to medical appointments, and listened to their stories. Each one taught me something about the real human cost of burn injuries that the trial photos couldn't capture. The permanence of it, the way it affected every single day of their lives, the constant pain and medical procedures. I started understanding in my bones what I'd done to Reese and Maxine. Caleb reached out to me about 2 months after sentencing through a brief text message. He said Reese was doing okay physically, but had a long road ahead. He'd had 2 more surgeries to improve the scarring and was in physical therapy 3 times a week trying to regain full mobility in his hands. The nerve damage made it hard for him to grip things properly. Caleb sent updates every few weeks after that, always short and factual. He never mentioned whether Reese asked about me or what he thought about the verdict. I appreciated the updates even though they made me feel worse each time. Through Caleb, I learned that Maxine had moved back to her hometown to live with her parents while she recovered. Her medical bills were still piling up despite the restitution, and she'd filed a civil lawsuit against me for additional damages. My lawyer handled the settlement negotiations, and we ended up using my entire portion of the divorce assets to pay her. The house money, the savings, everything went to Maxine's medical expenses. I was left essentially broke, starting over from nothing at 35 years old. 6 months after the fire, I was picking up a prescription at a medical supply store when I saw Reese standing near the bandage aisle. My first instinct was to leave before he noticed me, but he turned and our eyes met. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he walked over slowly. Up close, I could see the scars on his neck above his collar, and the way his right hand didn't quite close all the way. We stood there awkwardly until I asked how he was doing. He said better physically, but still struggling mentally with everything that happened. His voice was quiet and tired. I told him I was sorry. Really, truly sorry for what I did. He nodded slowly and said he thought about the affair constantly now. How he wished he'd just been honest about wanting out of our marriage instead of sneaking around. I admitted I wished I'd just divorced him when I found those texts instead of letting rage consume me the way it did. We talked for maybe 5 minutes total, both of us holding our prescriptions and avoiding too much eye contact. Before he left, Reese said something that stuck with me. He said we'd both destroyed each other in different ways, his betrayal and my revenge, and now we both had to live with the permanent damage we'd caused. I walked away from that encounter feeling strange, like we'd both finally said what needed saying without actually fixing anything. The next week, I started seeing my therapist twice a week instead of once, sitting in her small office with the plant in the corner while she helped me understand what I'd become. She never told me I was a monster or that what I did was okay. Instead, she asked me questions that made me look at my choices from angles I'd been avoiding. During one session, she handed me a worksheet about harm and accountability, and I filled it out with shaking hands as I wrote down exactly what my revenge had cost Reese and Maxine in medical bills, pain, and permanent scars. The therapist explained that acknowledging harm doesn't erase it, but it stops you from making the same mistakes again. I started keeping a journal where I wrote about the fire and what led up to it, forcing myself to see the progression from hurt wife to someone who deliberately put people in danger. My community service hours at the burn center became less about punishment and more about learning. I watched the nurses change dressings and help patients through painful exercises, seeing firsthand the long recovery process I'd caused for 2 people. Rita started coming to some of my therapy sessions after I asked her to join me. We sat together on the therapist's couch while I apologized for lying to her and for becoming someone she didn't recognize. Rita cried and told me she'd been so disappointed because she knew I was better than revenge, that I'd been raised to handle pain without destroying others. Over the next few months, we had coffee every week, slowly rebuilding trust through honest conversations where I didn't hide from what I'd done. She told me that growth meant accepting consequences and choosing differently next time, that I couldn't undo the fire, but I could decide who I'd be moving forward. 1 year after the fire, I walked into the burn center for my final community service shift, before transitioning to a paid position they'd offered me. My probation was almost complete, and I'd paid off most of the restitution through payment plans that would follow me for years. I'd learned that revenge doesn't heal betrayal. It just creates new wounds that scar everyone involved. Through Caleb's updates, I knew Reese was doing better physically, and had started dating someone new, and Maxine had moved back home but was working again despite her scars. We were all moving forward with our lives, permanently marked by that night. My life wasn't what I'd planned when I married Reese 10 years ago, but I was building something real from the ruins of my marriage and my choices. I worked with burn patients now, using my experience to help others avoid the path I'd taken. And every day I chose to be someone different from the woman who'd sprayed perfume on her husband's clothes.